always hard for me to turn that off. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Steven in New Hampshire, Shendor in the Bronx, Bill in mid-Missouri, so glad you're here. Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Yehud in South Carolina, Paula, Lorraine in Texas, Lucy in Minnesota, Belle in Texas, Tom in PA, Elvis in New York, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, and Chaim in Florida. So glad you're here. Marjorie in Georgia, Ilanit in Silver Spring. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by our own Bill Eldridge, who says, today, September 17th, is my 34th birthday. Happy birthday, Bill. Yom Huledet Sameach. As we speak, I'm also in the process of writing 2 papers on public libraries and community gardens. One practical on what some are doing, and one focused on the potential these partnerships have for strengthening our communities and improving our environments. Both of these will look very good for the theology PhD programs I'm applying to this fall for next year. It was only pure chance that I managed to get the position that's letting me write these papers, but as we know, there is no such thing as coincidence. So in gratitude for God giving me this opportunity, and in gratitude to him for giving me another year of life, I wanted to sponsor today's class. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May the Holy One bless you and all your loved ones and shower you with unlimited blessings. We say Amen. And I'm going to give a shofar blast to you on an incredible shofar. My friends, look at this. Chaim in Florida. Thank you so much. This came into your possession, and for some reason you decided that I should have it. I'm blown away. I mean, it's unbelievable. There it says Jerusalem. I think this is silver. I can't believe you sent this to me. So let me see if I can get our first silver filigreed shofar blast out. It's a somewhat narrow and long shofar, and the mouth hole's a little on the small side. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just I have big clunky lips, so it's a little bit of an extra challenge for me. Let's see what we can do. So from Chaim in Florida, thank you, and may the Holy One shower you and all your loved ones in blessings. Here comes the shofar, and dedicating a happy birthday blast for Bill. Okay, please God, strengthen me to make a good blast. Beautiful shofar. Thank you so much, Chaim. Thank you so much, Bill. It's really a privilege and an honor having you both in our class. Another relatively short daf, as they have been here in Tractate Bava Basra for weeks. Our daf today is page 87. Here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We've been working our way through chapter 5. Today, opening and, God willing, completing Mishnahs 9 and 10. And this is the longest tractate. And we're getting close to the end of, in the Koran, it's divided into 2 volumes. So 91 pages in this volume. Yeah, 91 pages, and then we'll just switch over to volume 2. It's just how they broke it up into 2 books, but it's really just one tractate. Okay, our daf is page 87. Mishnah number 9 here in chapter 5. With regard to one who sells food or drink that has an established price, such as wine and oil to another, and the price rises or falls, and the buyer or the seller wishes to renege on the sale, if the price changed before the measuring vessel is filled, the merchandise still belongs to the seller, and he can cancel the sale. Once the measuring vessel is filled, the merchandise belongs to the buyer, and the seller can no longer cancel the sale. And if there was a middleman, known as a sarsur, between them and the barrel belonging to the middleman and being used to measure the merchandise broke during the transaction, and the merchandise is ruined, so it broke for the middleman, i.e. he is responsible for the ruined merchandise. Now the Mishnah teaches an additional halacha, an additional law with regard to sales. And anyone who sells wine, oil, or similar liquids is obligated, after he transfers the liquid into the buyer's vessel, to drip for him 3 extra drops from the measure to make sure that the buyer got everything that he paid for. And after the seller drips those 3 drops, if he turned the barrel on its side and drained out the last bits of liquid that it contained, well, that belongs to the seller, and he is not required to give these very last drops to the buyer. It's enough that he did the measure plus 3 drops. And the storekeeper is not obligated to drip 3 drops because he is too busy to do this constantly. Rabbi Yehuda says if the sale occurs on Erev Shabbos, Friday afternoon, as nightfall is coming, one is exempt from dripping these 3 drops, as there is a need to complete the transaction before Shabbos begins. That is our Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Gemara clarifies the Mishnah's statement that the sale occurs once the measuring vessel has been filled. In other words, the sale has been finalized. It cannot be, the seller cannot cancel the sale at this point. So this measuring vessel, to whom does it belong? If we say that the measuring vessel belongs to the buyer, why does the Mishnah teach that before the measuring vessel is filled, the merchandise still belongs to the seller? Since it is the measuring vessel of the buyer, he should acquire everything that is placed in his vessel, whether or not it is filled. In other words, his vessel is acquiring what is poured into it for him. He's already agreed to pay. So now that this liquid is entering his vessel, right, his measuring cup, which is the same as his basket, like what we were talking about yesterday, that your vessel acquires something for you, finalizes the deal. So if it's the buyer's vessel, we don't have to wait until it's filled for the sale to be final. Everything, once it hits the buyer's vessel, becomes his. That part of the transaction is done. But if we say that the measuring vessel belongs to the seller, then why does the Mishnah teach that once the measuring vessel is filled, the merchandise belongs to the buyer? Since the measuring vessel belongs to the seller, the merchandise has yet to enter the possession of the buyer. Even once it's full, the buyer is going to have to perform some kind of a kinyan to take possession of what was in that vessel before the sale is finalized. So Rabbi Ella says the Mishnah is referring to a case where the measuring vessel belongs to the middleman. So the middleman lends it to the seller, and once it is filled, then it is loaned to the buyer so that he can transfer its contents into his vessels. And the Gemara asks, but from the fact that the latter clause teaches, and if there was a middleman between them and the barrel broke, it broke for the middleman. From this it may be inferred that in the first clause, we are not dealing with a middleman. So the Gemara answers, the first clause of our Mishnah addresses a measuring vessel that belongs to a middleman, but he's not there. He's not present. It's his vessel, but he's not there. Whereas the latter clause of our Mishnah is concerned with a middleman himself, who is present at the sale and therefore accepts responsibility for the barrel and its contents. Now, the Mishnah also taught that if the seller turned the barrel on its side, right, so after he fills the measuring cup and gives that to the buyer, and then he has to pour out 3 additional drops to make sure that the buyer got everything that he paid for, if anything else emerges from that barrel, it stays with the seller. He's already fulfilled his obligation by filling the measuring vessel and adding 3 drops. So the Gemara relates, when Rabbi Elazar ascended from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, from the Jewish community in Babylonia to the land of Israel, he found the sage Zeri and said to him, who here is the Tana, a rabbi of the Mishnaic period, who here is the Tana to whom Rav taught this law with regard to measures? And Zeri showed him Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said to Rabbi Elazar, what is it about this law that poses a difficulty for you? And Rabbi Elazar said to him that the problem is that we learned in the Mishnah, if he turned the barrel on its side and drained out the last bits of liquid within it, that liquid belongs to the seller. Now we're on page 87b. But didn't we learn in a Mishnah in Tractate Terumos 11.8, if one poured oil or wine of terumah from one vessel to another and turned the vessel on its side and drained out the last bits of liquid inside, this is terumah, and it must be given to the priest. Terumah is the first portion of the tithing process, the first 2% of the produce. That would apply to grain from a farm. It also applies to wine from a vineyard. And that first 2% is when the temple is standing and we're doing the full tithing process. So it's given to a Kohen, to a priest. And only a priest may consume terumah. And what's more, the terumah must be in a state of tahara, ritual purity. And the priest must himself be in a state of tahara, a ritual purity, when he consumes the terumah. At any rate, here we're saying that the last bits, even beyond the 3 drops, every little bit that's in that vessel has to be given to the priest. So why, in the case of terumah, every last drop has to go to the one who is acquiring, right? In this case, the priest receiving terumah, who is here being compared to the buyer. Why doesn't the buyer receive every last drop that emerges from that vessel when we see in the law of terumah that the priest does receive every last drop? And Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said to Rabbi Elazar, but wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Rabbi Abahu says, due to the... Wait a minute. Yeah. But wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Rabbi Abahu says, due to the despair of the owner who relinquishes his right to such a small amount of wine or oil, the sages touched upon it and ruled that any remnants extracted from the vessel belong to the seller. By contrast, with regard to terumah, which is forbidden to non-priests, the despair of the buyer is irrelevant, and therefore anything that remains in the vessel is terumah. In other words, since this has been consecrated, the seller who's here, the seller is being compared to the one who's tithing and giving his terumah to a priest, but terumah is consecrated food that the one who's giving it to the priest, he himself can't consume it. Only the priest can consume it. So if there's any chance that some of liquid or grain has been consecrated as terumah, he has to give it to the priest because he's prohibited from consuming it. By contrast, in just the more simple law, more common, just in the simple law of buying and selling, where the seller is giving something to the buyer, okay, he measured out the correct amount, he gave 3 more drops. Anything beyond that, the buyer doesn't really care about. He got what he paid for, plus 3 extra drops to make sure. He doesn't need to stand there to get every last drop out of the barrel, and that's why we say it can stay with the seller. The Mishnah teaches, and the storekeeper is not obligated to drip the 3 drops. So Rabbi Yehuda says if the sale occurs on Shabbos Eve, meaning Erev Shabbos, Friday afternoon, when everyone's in a hurry to complete any commercial transactions so that we don't, step into Shabbos and do something prohibited like buying and selling. So we got to get it done. Plus, everyone's always in a hurry to finish their Shabbos preparations. So are we saying that a storekeeper never has to do the 3 drops, or only on Erev Shabbos he doesn't have to do the 3 drops? Rabbi Yehuda says, if the sale occurs on Erev Shabbos, one is exempt from dripping these 3 drops. So a dilemma was raised before the sages. Is Rabbi Yehuda referring to the first clause of the Mishnah? And if so, his ruling is lenient, as the Mishnah states that one must drip 3 drops, and he states that on Erev Shabbos, one is exempt from doing that. Or perhaps he's referring to the latter clause, and he's being stringent, as the Mishnah teaches that a storekeeper is always exempt, whereas Rabbi Yehuda rules that this is the law only on Erev Shabbos, and otherwise the storekeeper is not exempt from doing the 3 drops, even if he's running a busy shop. And the Gemara answers, come in here a resolution of this dilemma, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, on Erev Shabbos, at nightfall, a storekeeper is exempt because the storekeeper is busy. And this proves that Rabbi Yehuda was referring to the latter clause of the Mishnah, i.e. he exempts the storekeeper from dripping those last 3 drops only on Erev Shabbos, only on Friday afternoon. But the rest of the week, the storekeeper is like everybody else who is selling and selling a liquid, and after he measures, he has to do those 3 drops to make sure the buyer got what he paid for. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9. Now, Mishnah number 10. Let me just make an adjustment here. Mishnah 10. With regard to one who sends his son to a storekeeper with a pundeyon coin. That coin is worth 2 isar. Right? So this is like a 2 isar coin, where an isar is another coin that's worth half the amount of the pundeyon. So a man sends his son to a storekeeper with this pundeyon coin in his hand, and the storekeeper measured oil for him worth 1 isar, and he gave the man's son the 2nd isar as change. And the son, on his way home, broke the jug of oil and lost the isar. So in that situation, the storekeeper must compensate the father, as he gave the jug and coin to one who is not halakhically competent, meaning the son was a minor, so it was a child. A man sent his child with a 2 isar coin to the store, and the storekeeper measured oil for this, boy, gave him a jug of oil and the change. So the jug of oil was worth 1 isar. He gave the change, which was another isar, and sent the boy on his way. And then the boy, who was just a boy, got distracted, tripped, started playing a game, who knows, but the jug of oil broke, and the isar coin was lost. And in that situation, says the anonymous author of the Mishnah, the storekeeper is liable. Didn't the man, the father, send his minor son to pick up oil and get the change from that 2 isar coin? Why is the storekeeper liable? Well, there's no agency for someone who's not halakhically competent. So even though the man sent his son, we can say that the son was just informing the storekeeper that his father would like an isar worth of oil and the change. But in terms of sending it to the man, the storekeeper should have sent an adult. Instead, he sent it with the child, and that's why it's going to be his loss. Let's keep reading. Rabbi Yehuda, now the minority opinion in this Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda exempts the storekeeper from liability, as he holds that the father sent his son in order to do this, i.e. to bring back the jug and the coin. And the rabbis, the majority, concede to Rabbi Yehuda with regard to a case when the jug is in the hand of the child, and the storekeeper measured the oil into it, that the storekeeper is exempt if the child breaks the jug. In other words, if the father sent his son with a jug and said, my father would like you to fill this jug with oil and give me change, okay, well then it's the father who deputized his minor son, which he shouldn't have done, therefore something is lost, it's the father's loss. But in the first case, he didn't send the son with a jug. The son just said, my father would like to buy. So delivering the oil and the change with this minor, that was an unnecessary risk that the storekeeper took. If he didn't want to deliver it, he should have said to the son, tell him, your father, that I have it in stock, but I can't send it back to him with a minor, so if he'd like to come in and get it, he can do so. That would have been what the storekeeper should have done. Now the Gemara. Granted, with regard to the Isser coin and the oil, one can explain that they disagree over this matter, right? The majority in the Mishnah disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda. As the rabbis hold that the father sent his son to inform the storekeeper that he needed oil, but did not intend for the storekeeper to send the oil with the boy. And for this reason, if the storekeeper gave the child the oil, he is liable for its loss. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that he sent his son so that the storekeeper would send him back with the oil. And therefore, the storekeeper is exempt from liability. But if the child broke the jug, why do the rabbis hold that the storekeeper is responsible for it? It is a deliberate loss on the part of the father, as he entrusted the jug to his young son, who is not responsible enough to care for it. Rav Hoshaya said, here we are dealing with a proprietor who sells jugs. And the father sent his son with a jug, in case the store owner might want to buy it. And this is a case where the storekeeper took the jug in order to examine it. And the ruling is in accordance with the statement of Shmuel. As Shmuel says, with regard to one who takes a vessel from a craftsman in order to examine it and buy it if he chooses, and an accident occurred while it was in his possession and it broke, he is liable to pay restitution for the vessel. You broke it, you bought it, right? You pick it up, and even in the place in the guy's store, you pick it up to examine it, and you broke it, you bought it, right? That's what we're learning here. Why? Because this person who picks up the jug to look at it and examine it to decide if he wants to buy it or not, he has the halakhic status of a borrower. And therefore, he bears financial responsibility if he drops it and it's lost. The Gemara asks, shall we say that the opinion of Shmuel is subject to a dispute between Tanaim? Since Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the rabbis, his opinion evidently differs from that of Shmuel. So rather, Rabbah and Rav Yosef both say that the disagreement in the Mishnah should be explained like this. Here we are dealing with a storekeeper who sells jugs, and the father sent his son to buy from him a jug filled with oil. And Rabbi Yehuda follows his own line of reasoning, as explained above, that the father sent his son to bring back the merchandise, and therefore if the son drops it, it's his loss. And the rabbis follow their line of reasoning, that the father sent the son only to inform the storekeeper of what he needed, but not for his son, who's a minor, to carry it back. And the Gemara asks, if that is so, say that the last clause, in which the Mishnah read, the rabbis conceded to Rabbi Yehuda in a case when the jug was in the hand of the child, and the storekeeper measured the oil into it, that the storekeeper is exempt. So why would the rabbis rule that the storekeeper is exempt? But you said that the father sent his son only to inform the storekeeper of his order, but he did not intend for the storekeeper to give anything to his son. So rather, Abaye bar Avin and Rabbi Hanina bar Avin both say that the disagreement in the Mishnah should be explained in a different way, like this. With what are we dealing here? Now we're at the top of page 88a. The Mishnah is referring to a case where the storekeeper took the jug from the child in order to measure with it for him. And because he took it in his hands, he is liable in the event of an accident in accordance with the opinion of Rabbah. As Rabbah says with regard to the obligation to return lost animals, even in a case where the finder is exempt from caring for the animal and returning it to its owner, for example, if he is an elderly person, and it is difficult for him, or if it is beneath his dignity to find a lost animal and start taking care of it, if he struck the animal in order to lead it, then he has just become obligated to return it. Likewise, the rabbis here maintain that the storekeeper's action renders him liable for the jug. In other words, even though you're not intending to purchase the jug, there are certain actions which can make you responsible for it. Like if you pick up merchandise in somebody's store, maybe without his permission. Like if he says to you, hey, take a look at this, see if you like it. Okay, then he has lent it to you with his permission, and you can look at it. And then we could talk about if you drop it, have you bought it or not. But if without being invited, you just pick it up to examine it and you drop it, sounds like you're going to be liable. different area of the law, finding lost objects. Okay, so a Jew is obligated, especially if he thinks that an object that is lost belongs to another Jew, then for sure he's obligated to do everything in his power to return it. And even if he thinks it doesn't belong to a Jew, it's definitely a Kiddush Hashem, right? It sort of glorifies the name of God for Jews to be people who find lost objects and put out the effort to return them, no matter who is the owner. But there are certain people who are excused from that, like an elderly person for whom it's going to be very difficult to take care of the animal, get it home, etc. However, if he starts leading that animal, either by striking with a stick or pulling its reins, whatever, but he starts moving that animal, so now he has taken control of the lost object, and it now does become his responsibility, even if he would have been otherwise exempt. So let's see how that applies. The Gemara asks, you can say that Rabbah says his statement with regard to animals, as the finder taught them to take steps away, i.e. he worsened the situation as he causes them to stray even further from the owner. Nevertheless, in a case like this, where the storekeeper took the jug from the child, did Rabbah say that the storekeeper is liable? The storekeeper's action does not make it any more likely that the jug will break. So rather, Rabbah said, I and the lion of the group explained it. And who is this great sage referred to as a lion? This is Rabbi Zera. And the explanation is like this. Here we are dealing with a case where the storekeeper took the jug from the child in order to measure with it for other people without the knowledge of the father. Now he took the jug from the child for his own purposes. So sure, he's going to be responsible if something happens to it. And the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda disagree with regard to a borrower who takes an item without the owner's knowledge. One sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds that the storekeeper is considered like any other borrower, and once he returns the jug to the child, he's no longer responsible for it. And the other sage, i.e. the rabbis, holds that someone who borrows without the other's knowledge, without the owner's knowledge, he is a robber. If you borrow something without somebody else's knowledge, you now become a robber. And it is not enough to put it back where you found it. You have to return it personally to the owner. Therefore, the storekeeper must pay for the jug that the child broke before it reached the father. The Gemara returns to the matter itself. Shmuel says, with regard to one who takes a vessel from a craftsman in order to examine it, and an accident occurred while it was in his possession and it broke, he is liable to pay restitution for the vessel. You broke it, you bought it. The Gemara explains, and this statement applies only in a case where the monetary value of the vessel is fixed, because he examines the vessel merely to ensure there is nothing wrong with it, and it is assumed that if he finds no defect, he will buy it. And the Gemara relates, there was a certain man who entered a butcher shop and lifted a thigh of meat to examine it, and while he was lifting it, a horseman came and seized it from him. The buyer came before Rav Yemar, who deemed him liable to pay its monetary value to the seller, because it was seized from him after he had lifted it. And the Gemara again notes, and this matter, meaning this law, applies only in a place where the monetary value of the item is fixed, and therefore lifting it is equivalent to finalizing the sale. Whereas, if the price of the item will require negotiation between the buyer and the seller, then the mere fact that he lifted it doesn't mean that he's acquired it, because he's looking at it, and now they're going to talk about a price. You can't finalize a transaction when the price has not been set. But if the price is known, and he picks it up and drops it while it's in his care, then he is going to be liable. Very interesting. The Gemara relates a similar incident. There was a certain man who brought pumpkins to the city of Pum Nahara. And everyone came and took a pumpkin with the intention of buying it. But they had yet to pay for it. And the seller was angry. And since he did not know from whom to demand payment, he said to all of them, the pumpkins are hereby consecrated to heaven. So if the pumpkins have not been sold, then this consecration takes effect, and now none of these buyers will be able to take the pumpkins home. On the other hand, if the sale has already been finalized when they picked up the pumpkins, then this consecration is meaningless because they're no longer his pumpkins. They came before Rav Kahana to inquire about the halachic status, the legal status of the pumpkins. Rav Kahana said to them, this statement has no effect, as a person cannot consecrate an item that is not his. And since the buyers had lifted the pumpkins, they no longer belong to the seller. Once again, the Gemara points out, and this matter, meaning this law, applies only in a place where the item's monetary value is fixed, and therefore lifting it is akin to finalizing the sale. But if the item's monetary value is not fixed, then it remains in the jurisdiction of its owner, and the seller did well, meaning he was successful when he consecrated it. New subject. The sages taught in the case of one who wishes to buy vegetables from the market, and the seller is an am haaretz, which is to say an ignoramus, and this is somebody who is unreliable with regard to tithes. We cannot assume that he tithed the produce properly. So a pious person who buys from an am haaretz is going to have to tithe the produce, even though it's possible that it was already tithed, but he's going to have to tithe it out of doubt to make sure that it is fit for consumption, because untithed produce is not fit for consumption. So, in the case of one who wishes to buy vegetables from the market, and the seller is an am haaretz, and the buyer selected superior quality vegetables from, In the case of one who wishes to buy vegetables from the market, and the seller is an am haaretz, i.e. one who is unreliable with regard to tithes, in which case the buyer is required to separate tithes after his purchase. And he selected superior quality vegetables from inferior quality vegetables and placed them to the side as he was considering purchasing them, then even if he did this all day, if he does not decide to buy the vegetables, he does not acquire them and does not become obligated in separating tithes. So if he had determined to buy the vegetables that he selected, he acquires them and becomes obligated in separating tithes. In such a case, it is not possible for him to decide to not buy the vegetables and to return them to the seller in their present state, as they have already become obligated in tithes. And likewise, it is not possible to tithe them and return them to the seller, as he would then lower their monetary value. So what should he do? He should tithe the produce, give the tithes to an appropriate recipient, a Levite or a Cohen, or a poor person, if we're talking about Meiser Ani, and give the seller money in exchange for the tithes that he separated from it. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And the Gemara asks, is that to say that because one determined to buy the produce, even though he says nothing and performs no act of acquisition, that he acquires the produce and becomes obligated in tithes? And Rav Oshaya said, here we are dealing with a buyer who is God-fearing, such as Rav Safra, who himself fulfilled the verse and speaks truth in his heart, from Psalm 15. So with regard to business matters, Rav Safra considered himself bound by his thoughts at the time of the negotiations, even if he did not express them verbally or perform any action. A person on the ethical level of Rav Safra acquires the produce and becomes obligated to separate tithes from the moment that he decides to buy it. That's a person at that much higher level of stringency, but that is not the law for average people. For average people, they have to perform some action that indicates that they intend to buy and that they have, with intention, acquired the object. But for a super pious person like Rav Safra, once he made up his mind to buy, he becomes obligated to tithe because he's buying from an am haaretz, and that's why the tithing is necessary. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 10 here in chapter 5. Okay, let's take some questions. Bill says on his birthday, happy birthday again, Bill. Clarify for me, when concerning terumah of, say, wine, do you take terumah from the grapes, from the wine, or both? Such a good question. We've definitely talked about separating terumah from wine. So it would seem that in the operations of a vineyard, now if somebody is growing grapes to be table grapes, okay, so he's going to have to separate the terumah from grapes. But if somebody's growing the grapes in order to make wine, then I believe the terumah is not separated until the wine is fit to, has left, has been, placed in barrels, and it's time and it's ready for drinking. That's at the point at which you're going to separate the terumah. Tom, is there a database of all the Tanaim and when they disagreed with the majority and when they agreed with the majority? I'm not aware of such a database. I'm not aware of one. But I do highly recommend, I guess it must be inside the house, but the Introduction to the Talmud. It's a separate volume in the Art Scroll Talmud, just called the Introduction to the Talmud. And there it has a biography of hundreds of sages, all the major sages and many of the minor ones. There's biographies of all of them. And you'll find that wonderful, a wonderful, wonderful resource. I've read from that a few times when we've done, Meet the Sage, which I haven't done that in a while. We need to do that. But yeah, the Introduction to the Talmud in the Art Scroll edition of the Talmud Bavli, wonderful resource. And you can get that book on its own. For sure, you can get it from Art Scroll. You could probably even order it from Amazon. Jonathan, price is fixed. If this is in the land of Israel or anywhere in the Middle East, this seems fanciful at best. What do you mean fixed price? There's no such thing. Certainly, right? Anytime you're in a marketplace, even in a shop where you're dealing with the owner, everything is negotiable. I think they're almost disappointed when an American comes in and he says, well, that'll be 100 shekels. And the American says, okay, because that's not the business. You have to negotiate and maybe sit down and have a cup of tea and get to know the seller. That's how business is done. Very good, Jonathan. And finally, Elvis, today's lesson in a nutshell: more practical ethical guidance in our business dealings. Just so. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular Wednesday time,